Declan always prided himself on noticing the little things. A subtle change in tone, a fleeting look, a slight hesitation. He believed these nuances were the building blocks of understanding someone. That's why, as the weeks dragged on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with Amara. It wasn't immediate. At first it was small things. She stopped laughing at his jokes the way she used to. Her once cheerful hums while cooking dinner had turned into silence. Declan chalked it up to stress from her job in marketing. She had mentioned new deadlines and a particularly demanding supervisor. But as the days stretched into weeks, the changes became harder to ignore. Their evenings, once filled with easy conversations and shared stories, had grown quiet. Amara spent more time on her phone, her expression closed off as though guarding a secret. When Declan asked what was wrong, she waved it off with a distracted smile, saying she was just tired. It was the way she said it, light, dismissive, hollow, that gnawed at him. One night he decided to test the waters. "Remember when we used to binge-watch those ridiculous mystery shows? How about we pick one tonight?" he asked, hoping to spark a familiar connection. Amara looked up from her phone, her face unreadable. "I'm not really in the mood, Declan. Maybe another time," she replied, her tone laced with a distant politeness that stung more than outright rejection. Declan sat there in silence, the weight of her disinterest pressing heavily on him. He replayed her words in his head over and over, searching for a crack in the veneer of her excuses. Had he done something wrong? Was he imagining things? The turning point came a week later during dinner. Amara was unusually quiet, pushing her food around on her plate without eating much. Declan, unable to contain his frustration, blurted, "Amara, you've been acting different lately. Is there something going on?" She paused, her fork hovering mid-air before setting it down carefully. "I don't know what you mean," she said, avoiding his gaze. "That," Declan said, his voice tight. "That right there. You're avoiding me, dodging questions. You're not the same. If something's wrong, just tell me." Amara sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're overthinking it, Declan. Everything's fine. Really." But her voice faltered on the last word, a crack in her carefully constructed facade. That night, Declan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Amara's words echoed in his mind, but it wasn't what she said that haunted him. It was what she didn't say. The next morning, she left for work earlier than usual, her movements rushed and almost frantic. Declan stood at the kitchen window, watching her car pull out of the driveway. Something wasn't adding up, and his gut told him this wasn't just work stress or exhaustion. As he sipped his coffee, Declan's mind raced with possibilities. He thought of the long hours she'd been working, the cryptic messages on her phone she quickly swiped away when he entered the room. Then there was the faint scent of cologne he didn't recognize clinging to her jacket last week, a detail he had dismissed at the time. Declan shook his head, trying to silence his spiraling thoughts. Paranoia wouldn't help. But deep down, he knew this wasn't paranoia. This was a pattern, one he'd seen before, long ago, in a relationship he thought he'd buried in his past. He resolved to keep his observations to himself for now. If something was truly wrong, he needed to approach it carefully. But the seed of suspicion had already taken root, and Declan couldn't ignore it any longer. Declan stared at his phone, the screen lighting up with a reminder about an upcoming client meeting, but he couldn't focus. Not when Amara's behavior over the last few weeks played on an endless loop in his mind. Every quiet dinner, every abrupt departure for work, and every time she avoided his gaze came crashing back with the weight of suspicion he could no longer ignore. He had told himself he wouldn't act on these feelings until he was certain. But certainty, he realized, would never come without answers. That's why, during his lunch break, instead of heading to the usual cafe with colleagues, he found himself parked near Amara's office. The idea of following her felt foreign, almost beneath him. He wasn't the kind of man to doubt his partner, or at least he didn't think he was until now. Yet here he was, gripping the steering wheel tightly, watching the entrance to the marketing firm where Amara worked. Time dragged on. The minutes felt like hours, as he debated whether this was truly necessary. But then, as if the universe had decided for him, he saw her walk out of the building. She wasn't alone. A man followed her. Callum, Declan recalled vaguely. an operations manager she'd mentioned once in passing. Amara and Callum didn't exchange words as they walked to separate cars, but there was something in the way she glanced back at him, a fleeting look that made Declan's chest tighten. Declan started his engine and followed her car at a cautious distance. She didn't head home or to the store like he'd expected. Instead, she drove across town to a small motel on the outskirts, the kind of place where no one asked questions. He parked a few spots away, his pulse hammering in his ears. For several minutes he sat there, willing himself to believe this was a coincidence. Maybe she was meeting a friend. Maybe she was helping someone in need. But as he watched her enter room 204, alone and hurried, his hope began to wither. Declan stayed in his car, torn between storming in after her and driving away as if none of this was happening. But the sight of Callum's car pulling into the lot moments later solidified his resolve. Callum walked to the same room Amara had entered. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He simply opened the door and stepped inside as though he belonged there. Declan's breath hitched, his worst fears manifesting before his eyes. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. His hands trembled, not with rage, but with a profound sense of loss. Everything he thought he knew about his marriage, about Amara, felt like a lie. But Declan wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. He needed proof, something irrefutable. He couldn't afford to let emotions cloud his judgment. So he sat there, his camera phone in hand, documenting the damning evidence. Callum's car in the lot, the time-stamped photo of the motel room door, and the duration of their stay. When Amara finally emerged an hour later, she looked around cautiously before heading to her car. Declan slouched low in his seat, heart pounding as she drove off. Callum followed minutes later, his face as composed as ever, as though nothing about the situation was amiss. Declan sat there long after they were gone, staring at the photos on his phone. He felt like a stranger in his own life, watching from the outside as it unraveled. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. Instead, he felt an eerie calm wash over him, the kind that comes when anger is so deep it numbs everything else. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Declan sat at his desk, the photos he'd taken at the motel glaring back at him from his phone screen. He had spent the night staring at them, questioning everything. His instincts had been right, but the confirmation didn't bring the closure he'd hoped for. Instead, it opened a gaping wound, a cruel reminder that the woman he loved was living a lie. But the photos weren't enough. Declan knew he needed more, something undeniable, something that would silence any attempt at denial or manipulation. He couldn't let his emotions dictate the confrontation. Amara was skilled with words. She could twist situations, make him question his reality. This time, there would be no room for doubt. Determined, Declan made a decision. He contacted a private investigator, someone discreet and professional. His voice trembled as he explained the situation, but the investigator assured him this was not an uncommon request. "You want the truth, Declan, and you'll have it," the man said, his tone steady and reassuring. The next few days passed in agonizing silence. Amara continued her routines, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath Declan's calm exterior. She kissed him on the cheek before leaving for work, her smile shallow, her affection a pale shadow of what it once was. Declan watched her go, his heart heavy. He wanted to believe there was some explanation, some reason that would make this easier to accept. But deep down he knew there wasn't. On the fourth day, the investigator called. "Declan, I have what you're looking for," he said. There was no triumph in his voice, just a grim acknowledgement of a painful truth. They met at a quiet diner on the edge of town. The investigator slid a folder across the table, his expression neutral. "This isn't easy to see, but it's clear." Declan hesitated before opening it. His hands trembled as he flipped through the photos. Amara and Callum together, their interactions intimate in ways that couldn't be mistaken for friendship. The investigator had captured them leaving the motel at different times, sharing knowing glances and subtle touches that spoke volumes. "I also have audio," the investigator added, pulling out a small recording device. Declan nodded, too numb to respond. He listened as voices filled the air. Amara's laughter, soft and familiar, and Callum's low murmur. Their words were mundane, plans to meet again, complaints about work. But the intimacy in their tones was undeniable. Declan's jaw tightened as he forced himself to absorb it all. Each word, each image was a dagger to the chest, but he refused to look away. This was his reality now. Ignoring it wouldn't make it disappear. The investigator broke the silence. "Declan, I've seen this before. I know it's hard, but you're handling it better than most." Declan nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, I needed to know." He drove home in silence, his grip on the steering wheel tight. The folder sat on the passenger seat, a physical manifestation of his heartbreak. He thought of Amara, her laugh, her touch, the way she used to look at him with love in her eyes. And then he thought of the woman in the photos, the one who had betrayed him so effortlessly. That night, as Amara came home, Declan was waiting. He studied her carefully, noticing the way she avoided his gaze, the slight tension in her shoulders. She kissed his cheek out of habit, but it felt like a stranger's touch. "Busy day?" he asked casually, masking the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. "Always," she replied with a tired smile, heading to the kitchen. Declan watched her go, his mind racing. He had the evidence he needed, but the next step loomed ahead like a chasm. Confrontation wasn't just about exposing her lies, it was about deciding what came next. And Declan wasn't sure he was ready to cross that bridge. Declan sat at the edge of the bed, the faint glow of his laptop illuminating his grim expression. The folder of evidence lay open beside him, each photograph and audio recording another piece of the puzzle, a puzzle he wished he'd never started putting together. Amara's betrayal was undeniable now. The truth was laid bare, and it left him raw, exposed, like an open wound that refused to heal. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Declan knew he had to approach this carefully. A confrontation without preparation could backfire, leaving him vulnerable to her lies or worse, manipulation. He needed control, not just over her, but over himself. The first step was practical. Declan reached out to a lawyer the next morning, someone recommended by a colleague. The meeting was swift but thorough, laying out the legal groundwork for what was to come. As the lawyer discussed the division of assets, the process of serving divorce papers, and the potential fallout, Declan listened in silence. His mind wasn't on the legalities. It was on Amara's reaction. Would she deny it? Break down? Beg for forgiveness? The thought of seeing her plead made him feel both vindicated and hollow. There was no joy in this, only a grim determination to see it through. Back at home, Declan began setting things in motion. He canceled their joint credit cards, moved half their savings into a separate account, and hired a locksmith to change the locks the day he planned to confront her. Every action felt calculated, mechanical, as though he were dismantling the very foundation of their life together. The confrontation itself required more precision. Declan didn't want to just accuse her. He wanted her to face the weight of her betrayal. He decided on a direct approach, one that would leave no room for ambiguity. The opportunity came 2 days later when Amara mentioned working late. Declan nodded, feigning understanding, while inside his resolve solidified. As she left the house, he followed at a distance, his camera bag resting on the passenger seat. He trailed her to the motel again, his stomach tightening as she entered the same room. Declan parked a few spaces away and waited, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he rehearsed his next steps. When the time felt right, he walked into the lobby. The motel manager barely glanced at him as Declan slid a $100 bill across the counter and asked for the key to room 204. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, but the money silenced any objections. With the key in hand, Declan made his way to the room. His heart pounded against his ribcage, a mix of adrenaline and anger fueling each step. Standing outside the door, he hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Was he ready for this? Yes. Declan turned the key and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The scene before him was both expected and shocking. Amara and Callum were caught mid-conversation, their expressions shifting from casual to horrified as they registered his presence. Declan didn't say a word. Instead, he pulled out the camera and began snapping photos, the bright flash cutting through the tense silence. Amara scrambled to cover herself, her face pale with shock. Callum stood frozen, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. "Don't bother explaining," Declan said, his voice low but steady. "I've heard enough lies to last a lifetime." He reached into his bag and pulled out the divorce papers, dropping them onto the bed. "These are for you," he said, his gaze fixed on Amara. "Consider them your notice that this is over." Amara stared at the papers, her hands trembling. For a moment, Declan thought she might say something, but she remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Declan turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You should be ashamed," he said, his voice laced with quiet fury. "Not just for what you've done to me, but for what you've done to yourself." With that, he walked out, the weight of finality pressing heavily on his chest. Declan paced in his living room, the silence of the house amplifying the storm within him. His mind replayed the scene from the motel over and over, Amara's wide eyes, Callum's frozen stance, the flash of his camera illuminating their betrayal. He had walked out without looking back, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavily on his chest. That night, Declan barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amara's face, her expression a mix of shame and fear. Was she afraid of losing him, or was she simply afraid of the consequences? The difference mattered, but Declan wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The next morning, as he sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, the sound of Amara's key in the door snapped him out of his thoughts. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Declan," she began, her voice trembling. "Please let me explain." He set his mug down deliberately, the clink against the table louder than it needed to be. "Explain what, Amara?" he asked, his tone cold. "Explain how you've been lying to me for weeks. How you thought I wouldn't notice." Tears welled up in her eyes, but Declan felt no sympathy. Not now. She faltered, wringing her hands nervously. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But it wasn't what you think." Declan let out a bitter laugh, cutting her off. "It wasn't what I think? Amara, I was there. I saw you. I have pictures, for God's sake. What more could I possibly need to understand?" She flinched at his words, her hands dropping to her sides in defeat. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. It just did." "That's the best you've got," Declan snapped, his voice rising. "It just did? You didn't mean for it to happen, but somehow you ended up sneaking around, meeting him at motels, lying to my face every single day? That wasn't an accident, Amara. That was a choice. Repeatedly." Amara sank into the nearest chair, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Then don't say anything," Declan said sharply. He stood, walking over to the counter where the divorce papers waited. He picked them up and placed them in front of her. "Sign these. That's all I need from you now." Her head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. "Declan, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do anything. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I'll make it right." Declan stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't get it, do you? There's no fixing this. You broke something that can't be repaired. And even if it could, I don't think I'd want it anymore." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she shook her head. "I love you," she whispered desperately. "No, Amara," Declan replied, his voice steady but laced with pain. "You loved the version of me that didn't see through your lies, the version of me that trusted you blindly. That man doesn't exist anymore." For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of Amara's quiet sobs. Declan felt a flicker of something, pity maybe, but he shoved it aside. He couldn't afford to let her emotions sway him now. Finally, Amara reached for the papers, her hands shaking as she picked up the pen. Declan watched silently as she signed her name, each stroke of the pen feeling like a nail in the coffin of their marriage. When she was done, she looked up at him, her eyes red and pleading. "Is this really it?" she asked, her voice broken. Declan nodded, his jaw tight. "This is it." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone at the table with the weight of her choices bearing down on her. Declan sat in his car outside the lawyer's office, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would shatter the fragile calm he was trying to maintain. He had just finalized the arrangements for the divorce papers to be served officially, ensuring that Amara's signature from the confrontation was legally binding. The lawyer had called him efficient, almost clinical, in the way he handled the process. Declan didn't see it that way. He saw it as survival. Driving back to the house, he felt the familiar mix of dread and relief. The locksmith would be there soon, ready to change the locks, and Declan had already planned to pack what he needed before the day was over. This wasn't his home anymore, not really. It was a graveyard of memories, and staying here would only make the healing harder. When he arrived, the locksmith was waiting by the driveway, a small toolbox in hand. Declan greeted him with a nod and gestured toward the front door. As the man worked, Declan moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, gathering his clothes, toiletries, and a few sentimental items he couldn't bear to leave behind. He paused at the framed photo of him and Amara on their wedding day, the joy in their eyes frozen in time. Without hesitation, he placed it face down on the counter. By the time the locksmith was done, Declan had his bags packed and loaded into the car. "Thanks for your help," he said, handing the man a tip. "No problem," the locksmith replied, his tone sympathetic. "Whatever you're going through, it'll get better. Just give it time." Declan nodded, but the words felt hollow. Time wasn't a healer. It was a constant reminder of what had been lost. That evening, he checked into a small no-frills apartment he had found through a friend. The walls were bare, the furniture minimal, but it was quiet. It was his. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over Amara's contact. He hadn't blocked her, though he knew he should. A part of him wanted her to call, to explain, to beg. But deep down, he knew nothing she could say would undo what had been done. His thoughts were interrupted by a text from Amara. "Can we please talk?" Declan stared at the message for a long time, his chest tightening with an ache he didn't expect. He wanted to ignore it, to delete it and move on, but curiosity, or maybe masochism, got the better of him. "There's nothing left to say," he replied, his fingers trembling as he hit send. The response came almost immediately. "I'm sorry, I know I hurt you, but I need to explain." Declan tossed the phone onto the bed, running a hand through his hair. She needed to explain? What more was there to explain? He had seen everything, heard everything. Her words felt like a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative, to paint herself as a victim in a story where she had been the architect of his pain. As the night stretched on, Declan found himself replaying their last conversation in his mind. Her tears, her pleas, her empty promises to make things right, they all felt so hollow now. He couldn't trust her, and without trust, there was nothing to salvage. The following day, Declan received a call from Amara's mother. Doris sounded tired, her voice heavy with emotion. "Declan," she began, "I know you don't owe us anything, but I need to ask, what happened? Amara won't tell us anything, and we're worried about her." He closed his eyes, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. Doris and Sam had always been kind to him, treating him like family. They didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess, but he couldn't give them the full truth. Not yet. "It's complicated," he said, finally, his voice strained. "Amara made some choices, and I can't stay in this marriage anymore." There was a long pause on the other end. "We're here if you ever want to talk," Doris said softly. "And I'm sorry for everything." After hanging up, Declan sat in silence, the words echoing in his mind. For everything. Did that include Amara's betrayal? Did her parents know more than they let on? He didn't have the energy to dwell on it. All he knew was that the fallout was just beginning, and he wasn't sure how much more he could take. Declan's phone buzzed late in the evening, the name Doris flashing on the screen. He hesitated before answering, his stomach twisting. Amara's mother rarely called, and after their brief conversation a few days ago, he knew this wouldn't be an easy call. "Hello, Doris," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Declan," Doris began, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry to call you again, but I need to talk to you about Amara." Declan sighed, leaning back on the couch. "What's going on?" She's not herself," Doris admitted. She came to stay with us after everything, but she won't eat, she won't talk to us. It's like she's completely shut down." The image of Amara, once vibrant, confident, reduced to a shadow of herself, was hard to reconcile, but Declan felt no relief, no satisfaction in hearing it. If anything, it made the knot in his chest tighten. "Doris," he said carefully, "I'm sorry she's struggling, but I can't help her anymore. She made choices that I can't forgive." "I know," Doris said quickly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not asking you to fix things, I just thought you should know. She's trying to make sense of what happened. She says she didn't think it would go this far." Declan's jaw clenched. "She didn't think it would go this far?" "Doris, she had an affair. She lied to me, to you, to everyone. This isn't about things going too far. It's about her actions, plain and simple." There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Doris spoke again, her tone quieter. "You're right, I don't know what to do. She's my daughter, and I want to help her, but she's broken everything around her, including herself." Declan rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion settling in. "I don't know what to tell you, Doris. I wish things were different. I really do." They ended the call shortly after, but Declan couldn't shake the conversation. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was anything left in him to feel for Amara. Pity, maybe. But love? Trust? Those had been burned away, leaving only ashes. The next morning, he received a call from Sam, Amara's father. Sam's voice was quieter than usual, each word weighed down by the strain of the situation. "Declan, I won't take up much of your time," he began. "I just want to say I'm sorry, for everything. You didn't deserve any of this." For a moment, Declan didn't know how to respond. Sam had always been a stoic man, one who rarely spoke about emotions. Hearing him apologize, sincerely, vulnerably, hit harder than Declan expected. "Thank you," Declan said finally, his voice tight. "I appreciate that." "I also need to ask a favor," Sam continued, hesitating. "Amara wants to talk to you, just once. She says she needs closure." Declan's chest tightened. The thought of seeing her again, of hearing her try to explain or justify her actions, made his stomach churn. "Sam, I don't think that's a good idea." "I understand," Sam said quickly. "But if you change your mind, let me know. Either way, thank you for everything you've done for our family over the years. You'll always be a son to me." Those words lingered long after the call ended. Declan spent the rest of the day in a fog, torn between his need to move on and the guilt that came with leaving behind people who had treated him like their own. That evening, he received a message from an unknown number. The text was brief. "Please, Declan, one last conversation." He stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. Finally, he typed out a single word and hit send. No, Declan had not expected this. After everything, after the divorce papers, the betrayal, the endless nights spent wrestling with the truth, he thought he had heard everything from Amara. He thought the final chapter had been written. But when his phone buzzed again and the name Amara appeared on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. He hadn't blocked her number. There was a part of him, however small, that still wanted to believe in her, in some impossible redemption. The idea that she might call to apologize was something he couldn't fully dismiss, even if he knew it would never change the outcome. Declan took a deep breath and answered. "Amara." "Declan," her voice trembled through the phone. "I need to talk to you. Please, just hear me out." There was something in her tone, a weariness, a rawness that immediately grabbed his attention. He had expected her to be defensive, to make excuses, but this was different. "Go ahead," Declan said, his voice low, betraying no emotion. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you, how to make sense of everything I've done," Amara began. "But I can't. I'm so lost, Declan. I feel like I've destroyed everything that mattered." Declan clenched his fists at his sides, the words she was saying cutting through the carefully constructed armor he had built. He had spent so much time trying to forget her face, her lies, and now she was pulling him back into a conversation he didn't want to have. But he stayed silent, letting her speak. "I know I've hurt you," she continued, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, But I owe you the truth. The real truth." Her voice broke then, and Declan could almost hear the tears behind her words. "Go on," he said, his voice cold. "I'm listening." Amara took a shaky breath before speaking again, each word seemingly weighed down by guilt. I was unhappy. Not just with you, but with myself. I thought I was doing everything right. Getting the promotion, keeping the house in order, doing what I thought was expected of me. But deep down, I wasn't happy. I felt empty. Declan's pulse quickened. This was the part he had always feared, the part where she tried to make it about her, where she placed the blame on everything except her actions. But there was something different in her voice, a kind of vulnerability that made him pause. I didn't realize how much I was looking for someone, to fill that emptiness, Amara continued, her words trembling now. When Greg started paying attention to me, when he seemed to care about me, She paused, taking another breath before continuing. I let myself believe that it was what I needed, that it would make me feel whole. But all it did was destroy everything. Declan's chest tightened. His thoughts flickered to Greg, the man who had been a part of their lives, a colleague whom he had trusted. The betrayal wasn't just about Amara anymore. It was about the entire web of lies that had been woven. I was selfish, Amara admitted, the words coming slowly, painfully. I was so focused on my own unhappiness that I didn't think about how it would affect you. I never thought I would lose you. I never thought it would go this far. But now I'm losing everything, Declan. I've lost you. I've lost myself, and I can't live with that. Declan felt his throat tighten. Her words, for the first time, sounded like the truth. The raw, unvarnished truth that he had longed for. But even as she confessed her guilt, something inside him refused to soften. He couldn't let her in again, couldn't allow her to twist the truth into something that still gave her an escape. You've lost more than just me, Amara, he said quietly, the pain in his voice unmistakable. You've lost yourself, yes, but you've also lost the trust of everyone who cared about you. That's not something you can just undo. It doesn't go away with an apology. There was silence on the other end for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I know. I'm so sorry, Declan. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could fix it, but I can't. I've made a mess of everything, and I have no one to blame but myself. Declan closed his eyes, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. Part of him wanted to reach out, to console her, to tell her it would be okay. But he knew it wouldn't be, and he couldn't be the person to fix her mistakes. I think you've said enough, he replied, his voice stories. And if you're looking for more heartwarming tales, make sure to check them out by clicking here on the end screen.